Okay, I'm high on a double dose of painkillers and going to make a response video. What could possibly go wrong? I'm being sarcastic. I'm responding to a point made in one of Sargon of Akkad's videos. I think it was a This Week in Stupid episode where he points out the US was found to be funding two groups that ended up fighting each other during the Syrian conflict and says it's a clusterfuck. And I'd like to respond to this point, but to explain Syria, I need to tell you how I got pregnant. At this point, my life resembles an amalgamation of Monty Python sketches, but my pregnancy will make sense by the end, maybe. So, I'm scheduled for a doctor's appointment regarding the aforementioned painkillers I'm currently high on, but someone at the doctor's office makes a paperwork mistake and signs me up for the wrong doctor. Turns out a pregnancy specialist shares the office with the doctor I'm supposed to see, so I end up getting an appointment for my pregnancy. And I show up, and I start filling out forms, and the forms start asking how long I've been pregnant, and around that point I go, wait a minute. So I talk to the secretary, and we talk about the fact I'm pregnant, and my appointment is to see a pregnancy specialist for my pregnancy, and what was handed to me were, accordingly, my pregnancy forms. But it didn't stop there. I had also done blood work. Someone either at the lab or the office saw the M instead of F, and of course since this person was pregnant, maybe the M was a typo, so my forms all got changed to F somewhere along the lines, and I find out there may be some cause for concern since I have far too much testosterone for a pregnant woman. Well, yes, technically yes, I do have too much testosterone for a pregnant woman, but I'm not pregnant. Or a woman, I think, at least not without a sex change operation. I'm sure I would be the prettiest princess in all the land, though. And the thing is, if you've dealt with medical bureaucracy for any length of time, you've probably encountered bizarre situations like this at least once or twice, simply because if you deal with extensive bureaucracy for a protracted period, you begin to notice that paperwork errors and mistakes are fairly common in the medical industry, the military, etc. Even when I was hospitalized for my appendicitis, I had to help a nurse do the oxygen saturation checks when I was supposed to be whacked out on morphine because she was so sleep deprived as the patient I needed to partake. I suppose this video may not really be a response as much as it would be an addendum, because while I wouldn't necessarily disagree with the assessment the Syrian conflict is something of a clusterfuck, by the definition that two parties funded by the same country ended up fighting each other, constituting it as a clusterfuck would make most wars clusterfucks most of the time by that standard. Think how bad these bureaucratic errors like my pregnancy are in the United States, and then picture how much worse they would be for something like the Islamic State or for managing funds for rebel groups that have their own agendas or something like that. Wars, especially political wars that have as many proxy players as the Syrian conflict, are marginally messy. For example, if you had an interest in the Syrian conflict, there are infinite variations of what that interest might be. You might want the Assad regime to win. You might want the Assad regime to win, but with weaker positions so you can have a better negotiation and trade position with them afterward. You might want the Assad regime to win, but after losing or gaining specific bits of territory. You might want the Assad regime to win under conditions they've signed some sort of trade treaty or alliance with a business you have a financial interest in. The amount of variations in just the few I've listed would be impossible to sit down and count all the possible versions of all the possible different treaties and alliances and businesses that could all possibly maybe be involved in, or some way become involved later at a later point, yada yada. You get the idea. Lots. Many. Giving aid to various groups is commonplace. It's not the end of the world if one group outlives its usefulness or attacks the wrong target. If you have a group that was operating in an area and fighting a target you want them to fight, you might give them weapons or money or food or medical supplies so they can continue operating. Maybe they change locations and start fighting another group and end up fighting a group you didn't want them to fight. Okay, that was a calculated risk. If you can't change their behavior, you stop funding them and instead give the weapons and food to someone else, unless you want them to fight a group you're funding, and there's reasons to do that too. Example, suppose I want the Assad regime to win for Machiavellian reasons and wanted some sort of trade agreement or some other benefit. Perhaps I could endear myself to them by proxy funding some rebel group through an offshore slush fund, then offer some government forces aid and information on some sort of rebel plot, and play it off as a big, heroic, generous sacrifice on my part, since it would probably be faster and cheaper to have manufactured that evidence myself than to have genuinely targeted a rebel group I had no control over or information on and actually have to work for it. That group of rebels was being funded they outlived their usefulness. They stopped being funded and ended up getting swallowed by some other group, or the funding allowed them to fulfill their purpose, but that purpose wasn't overthrowing the government, even if that was the group's goal. This is not the end of the world, nor is it particularly rare. It's useful to have groups fight by proxy, since they're motivated to fight for their country, and they'll accept lower life expectancy, and will be cheaper than a formal military deployment, and don't come with the same publicity disaster risks as a formal deployment would. It's one of the reasons fundamentally religious soldiers and suicide bombers are useful, because they believe they will be given heaven after they die. They will accept lower survival rates without the same morale costs or other risks of disgruntlement and the like. They're cheap and disposable and can be convinced that's honorable, or payment is rendered after death or some such. Why should I be overly concerned a group I was funding fought another group if their primary purpose is still being achieved? Group A is getting money and Group B is getting money and they're both fighting is nowhere near a complete picture of the complexity of the Syrian conflict. The reasons a particular group may be receiving funds by one or more parties is really a big list of unknowns. It should not be assumed the answer is something very specific. Maybe it is, but maybe it's not. Suppose I fund one group that's fighting 4 other groups, one of which I'm also funding. Maybe for a while they mostly avoid each other, so the expenses for when they fight are considered acceptable losses for a time, but after a while they get at each other's throats. But maybe that's also what I want, or can also make use of, or a combination of both. Perhaps I'm trying to contrive public interest and support for the government forces, so I slip evidence to one of these rebel groups that spies and traitors are in a town, and arrange a massacre of the civilians with cameras and publicity all ready to go, because in my benevolent generosity, I also funded a humanitarian relief aid project to go to the town with cameras and news and stuff. Keep in mind, many players in this will have given themselves moral superiority. If I'm a suicide bomber recruiter for the Islamic State, and all day, every day, I tell 7-year-old kids why it's great to die for the Islamic State, I've probably convinced myself I'm doing my part for the one true version of the one true religion, and will myself also be rewarded with paradise when I die. By that standard, I'm not manipulating or brainwashing these children, I'm saving their souls by making sure they'll have sworn themselves to a caliphate before they die. Everybody and their mother and their sister and their brother can contrive some reason their position is moral and honorable and just, because we're human. We do human things, like being sleep-deprived and making a paperwork mistake declaring some random guy to be a pregnant woman. These issues don't vanish when the stakes are raised. These factions and organizations are comprised of humans and affected by human flaws and behaviors. I think sometimes we forget that in the process of becoming passionate about something. Anyway, hopefully the video was helpful. Insert end of video pandering here, and I'll see you next time. Later, YouTube.